The year was 1948, and political tensions were at a boiling point. Democrats, led by President Harry Truman, had lost control of Congress 2 years earlier. Prior to his party's convention in Philadelphia, Truman had survived a primary challenge, only to see two formidable rivals emerge in the aftermath, propelled by contrasting views on communism and race. Ahead loomed a general election in a country hungry for change and roiled by intense ideological, social, and military conflict. Would the Democratic Party veer to its political extremes? Would the nation choose a new party after emerging from the Great Depression and World War II, only to confront a new array of challenges at home and abroad? It seemed Truman's only path to victory was as the ultimate compromise choice of both his party and the nation. This is Communism, Racism, and War, the election of 1948. Truman, the plain-spoken eldest son of a Missouri farming family, was an unlikely commander-in-chief well before the crucial 1948 election. The wildly popular but terminally ill Franklin D. Roosevelt knew before his final run in 1944 that his vice president, the left-leaning Henry Wallace, would be a vulnerable successor. He gave party leaders two choices as his new running mate: Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas or two-term senator from the Show Me State, Harry Truman. The latter was chosen in what became known as the Second Missouri Compromise. Roosevelt would die the next year, thrusting Truman, veteran of the Great War, into a nearly unimaginable position. He became the leader of a free world that was now competing with communism. His hardline approach to dealing with this ideology would become a topic of major discussion come the convention. Henry Wallace had little to smile about. 4 years prior, Roosevelt had replaced him on his final ticket. Wallace received the consolation prize of Commerce Secretary, but was swiftly fired once Truman assumed office. After the convention, Wallace, a committed socialist yearning for political redemption, tapped Iowa Senator Glenn Taylor as his running mate and revived the Progressive Party, threatening to siphon crucial votes from Truman in the looming general election.
Ann Cornell, the granddaughter of Henry Wallace, said in an email interview her ancestor was misunderstood and ahead of his time. Tainted with the communist label because of his encouragement of better relations with Russia and enraging many because he refused to speak before a segregated audience, Henry Wallace has often been remembered only for these negative connotations. If you review his quotes, Cornell said of Wallace, I think you would find him so prescient about the issues of today.
Truman also faced opposition from his own party's Southern wing. Despite using racial slurs in private, and even calling Reverend Martin Luther King a troublemaker, Truman was racially progressive, advocating for equal rights and addressing the NAACP. This did not sit well in the Jim Crow South. The entire Mississippi delegation, and half of Alabama's, had walked out of the Philadelphia Convention. The remaining Southern delegates had only stayed to vote against Truman. Just weeks after the convention, President Truman issued an executive order that attempted to integrate the armed forces and federal civil service. Democratic segregationists responded with the formation of the States' Rights Party, otherwise known as the Dixiecrats, with South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate. Their goal was to divide the Democratic Party, enough to force the election into the House of Representatives, allowing segregationist congressmen to prevent Truman's election.
He was young, handsome, and audacious. He hated Truman and he loved national attention. He had just gotten married to a young beauty queen who was half his age. This was a moment.
Like Wallace on the left, the charismatic Thurmond threatened to weaken Truman in the general election. It seemed there was no room for Truman to compromise with his party's extreme wings. While the Democratic Party was mired in conflict, the Republican Party had wasted no time coalescing around its nominee, New York Governor Thomas Dewey. Republicans believed a confident and united GOP could best a splintered Democratic Party, especially with Americans weary from nearly 15 years of liberal reforms.
The war had been over for 3 years, so we're kind of getting back to normal. A lot of the soldiers came back, and business picked up because it had been in a straitjacket during the war, pretty much devoted to turning out war goods. And so there was a big shift there. Business had gotten better. The stock market was up.
Dewey, an Ivy League lawyer who had been the GOP presidential nominee 4 years earlier, ran a deliberately non-committal campaign, trying to appease all parts of the electorate. Following his campaign strategist's advice, He avoided the most controversial topics, delivering empty, optimistic speeches, and vaguely mentioning his plans as president. With America seemingly craving change, Dewey was universally believed to be a shoo-in for the White House. Meanwhile, Clark Clifford, Truman's campaign strategist, advised his candidate to pitch to 4 distinct interest groups: laborers, farmers, African Americans, and consumers. Campaigning from the White House, Truman put his policies before Congress, where they were rejected. Truman used this failure to illuminate the do-nothing, good-for-nothing Republican Congress. Nearing the end of his campaign, Truman began his whistle-stop speeches, so called because they were delivered from the open platform of the presidential train. Making multiple tours around the country and sensing his deficit to Dewey, Truman used these speeches to ridicule the Republicans rather than promoting his own ideals.
Truman took a 25,000-mile railroad trip across the country during the 48 campaign that won him support in every little community that he spoke in.
The contrast between the familiar, if not so popular incumbent, and the general electorate's new choice in Dewey cast Truman once again in the role of compromise candidate. In a time of intense conflict, would the nation choose the man they knew or forge a new path? The choice was brought into sharp relief in films the respective campaigns shot that were played for free in movie theaters across the nation, lending each campaign an opportunity to establish their candidacy. Produced on a large budget, Dewey's films seemed far more professional, but cast the Republican as distant and cold. Truman's, on the other hand, relied mostly on newsreel footage from his presidency and struck a humbler tone.
Theodore Roosevelt's daughter called Dewey during the campaign the little man on the wedding cake because he had a little mustache. That was a devastating comment that was repeated all over the country.
On election night, despite Truman's slight advantage in the polls, the general consensus among pundits was that Dewey's original lead would hold. Such support is evident in the Chicago Daily Tribune's famous headline, "Dewey defeats Truman."
I have the plate that showed that. I have never seen a paper. This was the plate from the printing area, and I don't know how many they printed.
In the end, Truman defeated Dewey by a large margin, winning 28 states compared to Dewey's 16. Perhaps nearly as importantly, Truman's coattails allowed the Democrats to recapture the House and Senate. The threat once posed by Thurman and Wallace had fizzled. At a crucial crossroads, a nation in conflict had compromised by choosing the leader it knew best over his lesser-known challenger. Truman's triumph allowed him to confidently present the Fair Deal, which was a package of legislative proposals concerning public housing, education, minimum wage, federal protection for civil rights, and national health insurance. Though much of this deal either failed or was passed in a weaker form, the Fair Deal laid the foundation for the Democratic Party's future domestic agenda.
That communist forces have invaded Korea?
Truman's hard line towards communism was only furthered following his victory. When North Korea invaded South Korea, Truman sent in U.S. forces under General Douglas MacArthur to beat back the communist threat. With powerful China backing North Korea, the U.S.'s role in the Korean conflict was crucial to ensuring freedom and democracy for South Korea, which remains a key American ally to this day. Truman's staunch opposition to communism and the USSR led to the dissolution of the wartime alliance between the US and the Soviet Union by the end of the 1940s, ushering in the Cold War. The election victory cemented America's Truman Doctrine, which for decades defined US opposition to communism in every place and form it may manifest. In addition, Truman's legacy, including his progressive policies towards race and Executive Order 9981, laid the groundwork for much of the civil rights movement that took hold in the 1960s. In the decades following his presidency, Truman's popularity grew, with him earning the respect of presidents of both parties, seen as a common man thrust into leadership, who had done his damnedest.
I said to him, "Mr. President, did you make any mistakes?" And he said, "Anybody in this room never made a mistake. Let him put his wings on now and get the hell out of here." That was Truman.